and updates and insights on the war in Ukraine. This is, just to remind you, she got her PhD from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, but she is not from Nebraska. She's actually from Ukraine. So she comes by all her knowledge and experience, quite honestly. And thank you very much. And she's well published in a variety of academic journals, and she's known here, so I can shut up and let her come on up here. Thank you, Dr. Olena Lennon. We're looking forward to your comments.
All right, good afternoon. Oh, this is working. Delighted to be back. Thank you so much for sticking around. And I'm never the bearer of good news, but hopefully we'll have a good conversation anyway. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I am a Nebraskan too, although, you know, in Connecticut that feels like a different country altogether. That was my entry point to the US, so I do very much identify as that being a formative time of my life. But just a brief disclaimer. Yes, I'm a Ukrainian American. I spent most of my time teaching American foreign policy at the National Security Department at the University of New Haven. And I just want to kind of point out that I come at it as a Ukrainian American, and I'm a US citizen, so I mostly focus in my analysis on what's in it for the US, what American strategic interests are in Ukraine and the region writ large, what's best for the US, what's in it for the US. Obviously, I care deeply about Ukraine and the people of Ukraine, although I try to emphasize more so why this matters to the US and what are some of the strategic choices available to the US as objectively as I can. But more than anything, I really hope for a candid conversation today. I always enjoy engaging with your community, always wonderful conversations, and I really, really appreciate you paying attention and engaging with this subject matter. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is sort of engage more of an analysis of what's coming with the new administration. I think that's something that is on everybody's minds right now, is what to expect. It seems as though everybody around the world really is trying to get something done by January 20th. There's a lot of... So I hope that you've been thinking. If not, you still got time. But although not much. But you might have noticed that ever since the results of the US election became confirmed, and that was pretty much on election day, that there has been a lot of developments around the world with different actors activated for different reasons and trying to accomplish something in the anticipation that there will be drastic changes coming from the US, that the US foreign policy is going to be moving in a very different direction. Nobody knows what exactly awaits us, but I think various countries and actors and groups have been calibrating their decisions and their actions around this one major event, that on January 20th, the US will have a different president and different administration, and it's fully expected that there will be very drastic changes in the way Trump administration chooses to engage internationally. So what I wanted to talk to you about today is offer some of my analysis of what to expect from the proposed peace plan. One of the things that the Trump administration sort of became known for is how different their foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia is going to be from that of Biden's. Trump has been on record criticizing Biden for how he has handled the war, and I think some of those criticisms are warranted. But nonetheless, the narrative out there is that Trump is determined to end the war. Hence the title of my talk, in quotes, "The Prospects of Ending the War." So I'll give you some of my thoughts and insights on how possible, how realistic I think ending the war is, and even if it's possible, it's an existential war. It's a war of irreconcilable political systems. So I think, realistically, I don't think there are any prospects of ending that civilizational battle, but I think at the very least there may be opportunities for a ceasefire, kind of being more realistic in our ambitions. So what I want to start with is give you just a brief recap of what has happened in the last really 3 years. We're coming up on a 3-year mark since the war started. But currently, Russia controls approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory in the southeast. It is advancing, and as I said before, there has been a very noticeable escalation since really last October, where the Russians are trying to capture as much territory as possible at any cost. The chosen method, the tactic of choice in Russia is the human wave attacks. It's very much to use a metaphor, a meat grinder, where Russian infantry basically storming Ukrainian positions with really human shields. So artillery, missile attacks, glide bombs, and heavy infantry attacks, like I said, is what defined this war. So it is a war of attrition. But what has characterized the last few months is that Russian advances have noticeably intensified. And what Russia has been leveraging primarily against Ukraine is energy. So the Russians have, in addition to advancing, kind of trying to gain more territory, they have also been bombing civilian residential areas all across Ukraine. Even though the front line, the active combat area is limited to southeastern Ukraine, but the entire Ukraine is within range of Russian missiles, that they don't even need to leave Russian airspace to bomb as far west as Lviv. So the Russians have been mostly focusing on bombing power plants and energy infrastructure to pressure Ukrainians to capitulation. Basically, the idea here is that there is an expectation that Trump, as he said, will most likely force Russia and Ukraine to a negotiating table where it's expected that Ukraine will be pressured to agree to a ceasefire, most likely on Russians' terms. And one of those terms is going to be Ukraine should cede all of the currently Russia-controlled territory. So Russia is trying to take as much as they can before they sit down at the negotiating table, expecting that Trump may, in fact, impose the ceasefire, leverage military aid against Ukraine and force Ukraine to some type of an agreement. Now, I'll talk a little bit more later what that might look like, but for now, I think it's enough to say that the war has become more brutal, more indiscriminate, more genocidal, because civilians are targeted in broad daylight: shopping malls, schools, government buildings. 2 days ago, there was a brutal attack in Zaporizhia, in eastern Ukraine, where the single largest attack this year, or even like in the past year, where there's more casualties in one single attack than ever since 2022. So that is all to say that Putin has signaled very strongly that he is committed to this project, that the cost is, in his mind, is completely worth it, that human life, the value of human life is nothing, and that he's also trying to show that he's willing to outsuffer Ukraine and outsuffer the West in pursuit of his political objective of not just controlling southeastern Ukraine, but changing regimes in Kiev to where Ukraine can only exist as a pro-Russian state or not a state at all. So in its current formation, in its current political trajectory, Ukraine is unacceptable to Putin. And he has said it time and again that Ukraine is a manufactured, it's not a real nation, that it was created by the West to be used as a proxy military force to fight Russia. And it's unacceptable to Russia, and it's a threat to Russia's national security if Ukraine is a pro-Western country. So hence, we have already, after World War II, a new term came into being, and all the things that Putin has said and done in Ukraine, legal experts around the world have already agreed that that amounts to genocide. And I'll talk a little bit more about, the totality of this war against not just the Ukrainian government, but also the Ukrainian people. And that as much as we're consumed by news of the Russian military advancing, at the end of the day, this is not about territorial control. This is about political control and preventing Ukraine from reintegrating or the pro-European aspiration that they have been fighting for. Currently, about a quarter of Ukraine's population has been displaced, and every single family, the new statistic is that in Ukraine now, every single family has somebody who has been either killed or wounded in war or somehow affected by the war, whether at the front lines or outside the front lines as a civilian. So this is World War II level of humanitarian catastrophe. Obviously, it has forever redefined the Ukrainian society, the fabric of the Ukrainian society, infrastructure, culture, art, literature. It is a war-torn country where the society is completely consumed and traumatized by the war. And I think this will be, obviously, for generations to come, this will be a defining event for years and years to come. One of the, another important dynamics is that in March of 2023, the International Criminal Court indicted Putin and his Commissioner for Children's Rights of war crimes. So there was an arrest warrant issued to Putin and his other official for committing war crimes, and that is a reference to a special program that the Russian government started by saving the Ukrainian children. So it's estimated that approximately 6,000 children have been forcibly transferred to Russia under the pretense that they were being saved and given up for adoptions in Russian families. So again, this was an interesting case because it was self-incriminating. The International Criminal Court didn't have to do anything but watch in the Russian news. The Russian government bragged about it on TV. This was publicized. This is the first incident, the first case of genocide in history where it was actually advertised as such, and it was self-incriminating. This is sort of, will tell you of how, when we talk about negotiations, there is absolutely no reference point. There is no baseline. The Russia's view of what they're doing in Ukraine and everybody else's view of what's happening in Ukraine are completely irreconcilable. So there's a parallel universe in which it's not just fake news, right? The reality is completely reconstructed. So in that way, being able to agree on certain fundamentals will be very, very difficult because the Russians believe that they're fighting fascism in Ukraine. And they're completely justifiable in their actions. In fact, recently Vladimir Putin gave, during the press conference that he gave at the end of 2024, one of the journalists asked him if he believed that the war was worth it for Russia, if this was in Russia's interest to continue the war. And he said, absolutely, we have been doing the right thing, and this was the right decision, because there is nothing worse that can happen to Russia than not be treated as a great power. And I thought, well, that sounds like it's the most important thing to him personally for Russia to not be treated as a great power. But I doubt that Russia as a country or Russian people have benefited from it. Again, we're dealing with an authoritarian regime where Putin's personal ambitions and historical legacy is driving national interests. About 80% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed, so it's a major, obviously a major destruction. And it is also an area where a lot of reconstruction is needed. A lot of European countries are actually now investing in rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure because not only does it prevent Ukrainians, obviously, from denying Ukrainians basic needs, but it's also a major source of leverage for Russia. Russia always leverages energy. because a lot of European countries still rely on Russian gas, which is, has been historically cheaper. And what the Russians are trying to achieve is exhaust Ukrainians to the point where they will put pressure on Zelensky and say, end this war somehow, at any cost, because the conditions are unlivable. One of the other things that I think is going to be, or dynamics that is of global proportions, that Ukraine now is the most mined country in the world. Even deoccupied territories, those territories that Ukrainian forces have been able to deoccupy, are heavily mined. So a lot of casualties actually, including civilian casualties, have been due to mine explosions. All right, so just a few more updates from my last trip. I went back in the summer. I haven't been able to go back since then, but I will go back again this year. But one of the things that I noticed on my last trip to Ukraine was 2024 was defined by Russian glide bombs. Now, these are, and this is precisely, it's almost like these glide bombs, these dumb bombs that have been repurposed as precision-guided missiles, have been one of the most destructive weapons and cheap weapons that Russia has been able to reutilize. These are Soviet dumb bombs that the Russians have pulled out of their warehouses, and basically, to use a metaphor, duct tape AI to these dumb bombs, and they're now a lot more precise in their impact, but as destructive as the original dumb bombs. They're very hard to, and by the way, the damage is done on the cheap. So this has been the most dangerous weapon of war, against which there has been very, very few countermeasures. So Ukrainians have had a really hard time. They're almost impossible to intercept, but a lot of the destruction that happened in Ukraine in 2024 was because of these repurposed glide bombs. Now, this is an example of how quickly the Russians are adapting. The Russians are still, I would say, winning the adaptation game. Now, the Ukrainians have done wonders, and they have been absolutely phenomenal in the level of, especially defense tech innovation. When I was there in the summer, I was just astounded at how many more startups, various companies are actually now making drones, including children at schools. Everybody's assembling drones. There is this, Ukraine is now full of the so-called drone kitchens, where people literally get together and assemble drones in their kitchens. Anybody who has a 3D printer, and then they buy components online, and then they ship them to the front line. So the way this sort of innovation and ingenuity has trickled down to the level of school education is amazing. It is, of course, tragic, but it also gives you an idea of how clear-eyed Ukrainians are about the war that they're fighting, that it is existential and it is total, to where, can you imagine American children assembling weapons for the American army? The level of despair that there must be. Another thing that defined 2024 was double tap attacks, where the Russians strike to the same target after rescue teams arrive. These are egregious war crimes, but the idea is to exhaust the Ukrainians pretty much by January 20th, ideally, to where the country is unlivable. And it's also a signal to Russia's so-called sphere of influence, is that this is what happens to countries that decide to resist Russia, that the Russians will stop short of nothing to achieve their objectives, including these most inhumane, brutal attacks, striking the same target after rescue teams arrive, and increasing the number of casualties that way. All right, so what are the current escalation dynamics? One particular dynamic that should be of concern to all of us is that Putin's room for escalation has been shrinking. He has escalated to, in terms of conventional methods, the escalation pretty much has reached its potential. Every time the West gives Ukraine a new capability or ships a new package of military aid, Putin always threatens to retaliate. One most recent retaliation was when the Biden administration finally allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles, ATACMS, to strike back into the Russian territory. Believe it or not, 3 years of war and military aid to Ukraine, Ukrainians have always been under the restriction of not using Western weapons to strike back into the Russian territory. They could only be used defensively. But Russia launches most of its attacks against Ukrainian civilians from Russia. Ukraine is within range of Russian missiles. So Ukrainians have been hamstrung by this restriction. So the Biden administration, when they finally lifted this restriction, in retaliation, Putin actually deployed for the first time in history the intercontinental intermediate-range ballistic missile was deployed into Ukrainian city of Dnipro in, I believe, November of last year, in response to Biden allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons against Russian forces on the Russian territory. Now, to give you an idea of how how remarkable this event was, these types of weapons were in fact the reason why INF Treaty was signed, and both the United States and Russia were agreed to not be developing these weapons, let alone deploying these weapons. So the treaty became defunct when the United States withdrew from the treaty in 2019 because they suspected that Russia was not complying with the treaty, and they were actually secretly building these ICBMs, and they were right. So this was Putin's way of saying that they are, in their minds, they look at this war as a war that NATO and the West, the United States, is fighting against Russia with the help of Ukrainians. The Russian media permeates with messages of how this war is an existential war against Western, to protect Russian civilization from decadent West that has been trying to destroy the Russian civilization and Russian way of life. So the Russian public has been conditioned to think of this war as a war against NATO, that it's NATO bombing, killing Russians by using Ukrainians as mercenaries, basically. And the reason for that, there's multiple reasons as to why this is how they view this war, but one of them is that it's been a pretty humiliating military campaign for Russia. Remember that this war originally was a special operation that was expected to last 72 hours, and they were, the Putin really expected to overrun the Ukrainian government in Kiev, with special forces in 3 days. 3 years later, about 2/3 of Russian military has been depleted by Ukrainians, obviously with the help of Western equipment. So the way the Russian government has presented this to the Russian public is that, of course, they're in the back foot because they're fighting the largest military alliance on earth, and it's unfair, and Russia is a victim because they're fighting a war against NATO. And that is why they have suffered such losses. Another escalation dynamic is that Russia, for the first time in its history, increased its defense budget to a record 6% of GDP. Just to give an idea, you know that NATO countries, many of them still struggle to meet 2% of GDP defense spending. In the U.S., it's approximately 4%. I think it's a little bit more now. But the reason it's a significant development for Russia, because the social contract in Russia is basically based on this idea that for as long as people don't get involved in politics, they can expect a pretty, good social welfare package that will allow them to live in Russia, reasonably well. Nobody is particularly rich, but a significant portion of Russian of Russian federal budget is actually, in fact, allocated towards social welfare programs, because that's how people are pacified. That's how the Russian people are kept out of politics, is that they have been, from the get-go, people are conditioned to believe that politics is dirty business. Politics is where people die and get killed, is where they make poor tea choices, and sometimes they get poisoned by the tea that they drink, or they fall out of windows made by Germans. True story, that's Germans' fault that people fall out of windows. So the message is stay out of politics, and we'll give you a nice retirement, or you have a secure career as long as you mind your business, watch YouTube, but not news, and then you'll be fine. And it has worked. So the fact that the Russian government is now pretty much reconfigured their economy for wartime, that the economy is working for the war, that a large part of their federal spending is military expenses, that significantly undermines the legitimacy of the Russian government and their ability to pacify the Russian people, but it is necessary because they're struggling. Russia has presented war as a tool for social mobility. The best income in Russia right now is being dead. The benefits that families of deceased soldiers receive are unsurpassed, unmatched by any other potential income options, and that is also presented as a glorious way of defending of. Not spending, but giving one's life in defense of the motherland. Again, it's obviously glorified because the Russians are presenting this war as a civilizational war for Russia's survival. That said, the majority of Russian soldiers come from poor areas of Russia. They represent ethnic minorities of Russia, so it is not necessarily a fair game. About 10,000 North Korean soldiers are also now participating in combat on Russia's behalf. The Ukrainians actually just captured 2 days ago 2 North Korean soldiers, so we'll see how that's going to be unfolding and what kind of information they can get from them. But that is just another reason the war has acquired a global dimension. And that is another reason why it is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, and it is of concern to the U.S. because North Korea, Iran, and China have supported Russia from the start, but the level of support is getting deeper and on a bigger scale. So this used to be the red line, by the way. The U.S. government has for a very long time said that the involvement of other foreign militaries in combat is the red line for the U.S. And then it happened. So we'll see how the Trump administration will respond. There is a growing power, growing collaboration, and military ties between countries of the so-called CRINCs. I didn't make it up; it's an actual term. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Now, it's not an alliance. But it's definitely a stronger partnership where these countries are not only supporting each other politically in their anti-West ambitions, but they're also doing military exercises together. They're helping each other out with ammunition, exchanging military technology and whatnot. One of the ways in which I think was a dangerous dynamic for the West is that it is expected, or it is hypothesized, that one of the trade-offs there for Iran, North Korea, and China in supporting Russia is an expectation that Russia will help those countries develop nuclear programs, nuclear capacities. Now, we enter in a period where the war in Ukraine has emphasized the importance of nuclear deterrence. That I think everybody else watching this war is realizing that in today's predicament, where wars of aggression are not obsolete, land wars are not obsolete, nuclear escalation is not obsolete, the strongest deterrence is nuclear. Without nuclear weapons, no country could possibly feel safe, regardless of what, assurances, defense, security assurances they have from other countries. Nuclear deterrence is the ultimate deterrence, is what everybody is learning from this war. And so it's no surprise then that we're seeing an increased interest in pursuing nuclear status on the part of Iran and North Korea in particular, and China wants to wants to achieve parity with the US by, I believe, 2050, maybe sooner. Industrial base in Europe is not adequate for wartime production. The Europeans need to be now ramping up their defense production, but the last 70 years we have done the exact opposite. America's strategic objectives in Europe were demilitarization, and now it has to be rapid militarization so that Europeans can actually resupply Ukrainians as autonomously as possible, especially with the anticipation that the US might in fact withdraw or reduce its military aid for Ukraine. There's massive troop, weapon, and ammunition shortages in Ukraine. Ukrainians are holding the line. They're innovating. They're improvising. They are adapting. But that said, they're exhausted. Now, what I wanted to point out too is that one of the signals, or one of the, I would say, characteristics of the escalation too, is that despite sanctions, the Russians have not just been able to press on in Ukraine and maintain this military campaign, they're actually producing more ammunition than before 2022. So they're in full wartime production. If you look at, and this has been a war of artillery by and large, a lot of, despite the fact that both Russia and Ukraine are increasingly using drones and integrating AI in combat and decision making, nonetheless, artillery has been decisive. The Russians are now producing way more than the US and Europe combined. And this is also one of the ways in which they can outmatch Ukraine in military balance and press on with occupation and potentially a forced surrender on Ukraine. Now, that said, even though the European industrial base is just not up to speed yet, it will take time. The Europeans actually now are kind of stepping up to the plate and increasing their defense budgets. They're expanding industrial production, particularly ammunition, but it's going to take time. These are not the types of changes that happen overnight. In the meantime, the Russians are way ahead in rebuilding their military, and they're not expected to stop. And I think this is kind of one of the main messages here is, should we expect that the Russians will actually comply with a ceasefire or the war can end, knowing that they're actually ramping up their defense production, they're preparing for an even bigger war. Now, the good news, though, is that if you look at the graph here on your right, that you'll see that economically, if this was, if this is a contest of economic endurance, and war is fundamentally a contest of endurance, he who endures longer wins. And it takes economic endurance, military endurance, political endurance, all of it combined. Economically, if you look at the combined economies of European countries, they dwarf Russia. What's missing is political will. Now, can Europe outsuffer Russia? Absolutely. There's just no political will to do so. Which is one of the reasons why I remain optimistic that a lot of European, particularly Eastern and Central European countries, are now coming around to the idea that Russia has signaled very strongly that this war is not about Ukraine. This war is about rewriting the security order of Europe. It's about changing the way the continent operates. They want spheres of influence back. They want to be able to maintain their neo-imperial political regime and have the neighborhood or the near abroad under Russia's control. Russia never agreed to post-World War II security architecture. They said it time and again that they never agreed to NATO expanding. They don't like many of the sovereignty is not absolute from Russia's point of view, that sovereignty is shared, that medium-sized countries close to Russia do not have sovereignty, should not expect sovereignty, that the world is divided into spheres of influence where great powers, where might is right. That is Russia's way. So they're fighting these democratic institutions and unpredictability that democracies bring in trying to rebuild the entire security architecture. And it's not just a perception. In just the last year alone, many of the European intelligence services, the Germans, the Danish, the Danes, the Estonians, have put out reports where their intelligence services estimate that Russia's behavior had become increasingly more aggressive and belligerent against Europe. So the Russians are actually preparing. It is not ruled out that Russia will engage NATO troops by the end of the decade, as Estonian and German intelligence services predicted. Meanwhile, public opinion in Ukraine has changed, and I have to admit that as resilient as Ukrainians are, everybody is exhausted. They've been fighting the war. It's because they don't have a choice, right? To a lot of Ukrainians, many of my friends that I talk to who have become soldiers, they present this war as their choices is, how do you choose to die? Do you choose to die in occupation, or do you choose to die by fighting? And when those are the options, then it's not surprising that a lot of people have chosen to fight. That said, everybody's exhausted. The troops, many of the frontline troops have not been rotated since 2022, so you can imagine a deployment that long. And it's also reflected in the public opinion. You can see that in 2022, the percentage of Ukrainians who said that Ukraine will continue until it wins was 70%. There was great national mobilization and went down to below 38% last year. And then the blue line represents the percentage of Ukrainians who think that Ukraine should negotiate an ending to the war as soon as possible. It was 20% in 2022 and went up to 52%. So definitely Ukrainians are now ready for a pause, at least. I think there is a sort of realistic expectation that most likely the currently occupied territories will need to be ceded to Russia if that would be the condition of a ceasefire. All right. Despite the fact that Russia still maintains military advantage and still maintains quantitative advantage over Ukraine, it's important to point out that in many ways Ukraine has already won the war strategically. That it has been a strategic loss for Russia, some of Ukraine's strategic achievements include Ukraine has become more of a nation and more of a country than it has ever been. It has a very, very well-defined sense of who they are and where they want to go, and what type of a regime they don't want to be a part of. So the very, very idea that Putin has been trying to destroy, he actually cultivated. So there's a stronger sense of identity and unity. The West is more unified. I think the people in the West are more clear-eyed about Russia, what kind of a regime Russia is, what kind of a leader Putin is. I think there's still a lot of romanticism about Russia and Putin as being the great leader of the great Russia. I think those are hopefully fading from people's imagination, and people are more clear-eyed about the threat of Russia in undermining Western democracies. So defense spending in Europe has been going up. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. It could be a downside too, as Europeans have been demilitarizing after World War II, and now they're remilitarizing. This could be a dangerous dynamic, for sure, but it's important to be clear-eyed and actually face the reality as it is. Secretary of Defense Austin, actually on Friday at the last Ramstein meeting, said that American intelligence services estimate that the Ukrainians have depleted about 2/3 of Russia's combat power. And Russia is our main adversary. So this has been an important achievement. Putin's regime has been discredited even in countries where Russia has been, Putin still enjoyed a lot of popularity as a strong leader. I think America is one of those countries. A lot of people say. The more prominent examples of there's a lot of countries in the Middle East and Africa think of Russia as an ally, and that's an extension of the Soviet times when the Soviet Union was their main ally in wars of decolonization. So they look at Russia as the main ally in fighting Western colonialism. And that's exactly how the Russians have framed that narrative in that part of the world, is that they're fighting NATO, and NATO is Western colonization. So they should be sympathetic of Russia's cause, and they have been. Ukraine has become further integrated with NATO and the EU. Ukraine now has used every single weapon system designed and produced in the West, and they had to incorporate it into their own forces, even though they're not an official member of NATO, but they have been trained by NATO. They have used Western equipment, so there is deeper integration in Western institutions. The Russians have lost their foothold in Syria. It's been an important dynamic. It is, pretty much anticipated or expected that one of the reasons why, and the fall of Assad's regime in Syria is just a whole other conversation in terms of how unexpected that was. But the fact that the Russians now lost access to 2 military bases, or they're renegotiating with HTS now on whether they're going to be able to maintain their military presence in Syria, is a significant development, because the Russians have been so distracted by the war in Ukraine and so depleted that all of their military power projection elsewhere has taken a toll. And that is a strategic win for the US, that the Russians are not as big of a global power anymore as they've always wanted to be. And Ukraine now is a global hub for innovation, green energy, reconstruction, defense tech. All new ideas are now being developed and tested in Ukraine, because it's they don't have a choice, right? So for them, it's survival. But it's also sort of an attractive investment opportunity area for other Western countries. As I said before, one of the main achievements of the war, regardless of how the Trump administration approaches it or how it actually ends, is that Ukraine has, in fact, depleted a lot of, even though the Russians are rebuilding, but they had been significantly hurt and set back in their global ambitions. And Ukrainian armed forces take full credit for that. As I said, this comes from American government assessment. Since 2022, the Russians have suffered more than 800,000 casualties in Ukraine. Now, their military doctrine has classified Ukraine as a local war. They have not even treated it. In their military doctrine, Ukraine has not even entered the realm of regional wars, because they never even considered Ukraine to be a potent opponent to where they would expect it to be a regional war. The Russians have suffered more casualties in Ukraine in the last 3 years than in all of their wars combined. And so far, before Ukraine, the most lethal war for Russia was Afghanistan. So 10 years of Afghanistan was only a small fraction of losses compared to how many losses they have suffered in Ukraine. This with this in mind, and I'm going to quote what Zelensky said on Friday during this last Ramstein meeting in Germany. He said, given how far we've come, given how much has been achieved, as Zelensky said, it would be crazy for the aid to be withdrawn now, when the momentum is still there. So what What should we, we don't know. One of the things that, Trump is he leverages unpredictability. It's very important to Trump to be an unpredictable leader, right? Even though there are signals as far as what might happen, we don't know. But so far, what we have gathered from various interviews is that Trump's peace plan would pretty much include a demilitarized buffer zone that European militaries will patrol. Now, the European militaries have not agreed to it, but that is Trump's idea. And Ukraine has to draw up NATO aspirations for at least 20 years. That is Russia's demand, too. The U.S. military aid will have to decrease. Relationships with Russia should be improved, trade restored, or sanctions lifted. And as Keith Kellogg, who is currently the envoy for Russia-Ukraine for the Trump administration, in the summer of last year, in an essay wrote, America First, Russia and Ukraine. America First leadership must deliver a peace deal and immediately end the hostilities between the two warring parties. So this is kind of what we have in terms of predicting how the war is going to be approached. So why I think the negotiations are likely to fail. Number one, there's absolutely no incentive for Russia to negotiate. They had maintained the initiative, battlefield initiatives, the entire 2024. They have gained more territory, so they think they're winning. And Putin said it in multiple public presentations that the Russians everything is going to plan. They think they're winning, so there's no incentive. They want Ukraine to capitulate. That is what they think the negotiations will add up to. The aim is not Ukraine. Russia's aim is to change the post-Cold War security framework in which Russia gets to dictate the rules of the game, not just the West. Putin has demanded that Ukraine become neutral and demilitarized, basically capitulate. It's it's impossible. The size of the country that Ukraine is and the quality of the force, of the military force it is right now the most well-trained and professional army, the only national army that has actually engaged the second largest army in Europe, Russia. To expect Ukraine to demilitarize is unrealistic. Ukrainians will not stop fighting. It's just going to be fighting as insurgencies. Putin thinks that he has survived the most that the West could throw at him. He thinks that there is nothing more than the West can do for Ukraine, and we have already demonstrated that. No matter how much things escalated in Ukraine, no matter the level of war crimes and the level of genocide, the West has not taken it to the next level. They have not sent troops. They have not accepted Ukraine into NATO. They have not bombed. They have not even increased sanctions on Russia to where it would be prevented. We would be completely in a complete chokehold. The Russians are doing fine, even though the economy is struggling, but the military, they have been able to rebuild it. So there's a lot that the West has not done because there's no political will. So the Russians have tested the West's response and realized that what ended up happening was precisely what Putin had hoped for, is that he showed that Ukraine means more to him than Ukraine means to the West. And if he has survived thus far, then there's no reason to end the war. He can survive however else the West is willing to support Ukraine. Like I said, growing cooperation between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea has also empowered Russia. Russia's track record with ceasefires is very poor. Russia doesn't honor agreements, especially if they contradict their national interests. So there's no reason. There's been so many different ceasefires in the last 10 years that Ukrainians know full well that unless Ukraine capitulates, the Russians will not honor the ceasefire. And who's going to enforce it, lastly? Trump wants Europe to bear the brunt of the burden. Trump wants this to be a European problem set. He doesn't want America to be any more invested. And there's little appetite in Europe to send peacekeeping forces, and the Russians will not allow it. So this is sort of a dilemma that is currently unresolved. And lastly, what I think will happen if the U.S., in fact, withdraws their support from Ukraine and impose some sort of a ceasefire, which is code for Ukraine capitulates. First of all, the Russians are not they're not going to stop building their military machine, they're not going to stop fighting, and they're not going to stop threatening the West and Western democracies as being a threat to Russia's way of life. So if there's a pause in fighting, then that will give Russia valuable time in rebuilding, regrouping, and potentially restriking, which is to know where. So right now, Ukraine is the bulwark of European security and Europe's defense against Russia. Short of formal membership in NATO, it functions as NATO's eastern flank. So one way or the other, the West benefits from Ukraine fighting Russia. A weakened or defeated Russia means a weaker China, and that is currently, China is the #1 geopolitical rival. European security fundamentally is, we've tested this hypothesis before, that if Europe is in shambles, then America's economy suffers as well. And America is not as secure because Europe is our main trade partner, not China. Europe is our main trade partner, so our well-being is also at stake. Most of the military aid that goes to Ukraine stays in America, actually. A lot of these new defense contracts that the industry picked up to replenish capabilities given to Ukraine created jobs for America, and the money stays in America. NATO countries have now placed more contracts with the defense industry to replenish their capabilities. Money goes back to America, and that's why I think that at some point Trump is going to have received this brief about how much the defense industry benefits from this, and I think he might change his mind about withdrawing support. And lastly, if the U.S. were to withdraw their support, what will happen is that Ukrainians are not going to stop fighting. It's just going to be a massive insurgency. Ukrainians are armed. Many people have military experience. So, and in those parts of Ukraine that Russia will get to control, we should expect ethnic cleansing, as is what's happened so far. The U.S. will have to support Ukrainian insurgencies. Right now, they're supporting a legitimate national army, but if the Zelensky administration falls and Russia takes control of Kyiv, then we should expect that many Ukrainian civilians and the veterans will actually be fighting in organized insurgencies, and that will just not look good or be any more stable. America will lose credibility, and this is, as you know, in international relations, credibility is currency. Our deterrence is based entirely on how threatening we are perceived by our opponents. If China is watching this, Iran is watching this, Brazil is watching this, India is watching this, everybody is watching America's responses. If Americans withdraw their support, that will not be lost on other authoritarian regimes who will feel empowered to change borders. And then I think we will be in much worse predicament. It will lead to nuclear proliferation, as now a lot of countries are realizing that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, maybe the Russians would have not invaded. So I think that is also changing the calculus in other countries as far as if they're safe without nuclear weapons, and many are concluding they're not safe without nuclear weapons. So we're actually entering a new era of nuclear proliferation. Wars of aggression are, back again. So if Russia gets its way, then it will be on record that World War II security architecture that that made wars of aggression the mother of all crimes will pretty much be defunct if the West allows Russia to have its way. And it will lead to further regional and global destabilization. And I'll end on this note. I'll leave you with this thought. I am not naive enough to know that Ukraine's win is expensive. It is definitely an investment, and there's a lot of needs there on many different fronts. Ukraine's win will be expensive for the West, but Russia's win is going to be a lot more expensive. And I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you. Time for Q&A, and Mike has